My name is Jack Kayfabe, and tonight, we kill the illusion. You're about to hear a story that doesn't fit neatly into the version people remember. A story about pressure, damage, and the signs that were there long before anyone acknowledged them. This isn't about headlines. This isn't about speculation. This is about what was missed and what it cost. And once you hear it, you won't hear this story the same way again. There was a moment before everything fell apart, when the signs were already there. Quiet, subtle, easy to ignore. And that's what makes it difficult to talk about. Because the signs didn't feel urgent. They didn't demand attention. They didn't interrupt anything. They existed in the background. Not the kind of signs that stop a show, not the kind that make headlines, the kind you only recognize when it's already too late. Because from the outside, everything looked fine. The matches were still happening, the crowd was still cheering, the image was still intact, and Benoit was still exactly what everyone believed him to be. Disciplined, focused, relentless, a professional in a world full of performers. But behind that image, something was changing, and nobody wanted to see it. Because the version people saw was controlled, measured, precise. But control takes effort. It takes consistency. It takes repetition. And it takes energy that people don't see. Because when someone is known for control, they don't show you what it takes to maintain it. They show you the result, not the cost. And over time, that gap between what people see and what's actually happening starts to grow. Quietly, without drawing attention to itself, until it becomes something else entirely. Something harder to recognize, even for the person living inside it. Benoit wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, he didn't need to be. He built his reputation on precision. Every move meant something. Every moment in the ring was calculated. There was no wasted motion, no shortcuts, no excess. Everything had purpose. He wasn't playing a character, he was the character. And that's what made him different. In a business built on illusion, he felt real, and people respected that. They trusted that. Because when you watched him, you believed what you were seeing. Pain looked real. Effort looked real. Everything felt real. And over time, that realism became his identity. Not just something he did, but something he was. And when the performance is the person, there's nowhere to step away, nowhere to reset, nowhere to separate what you do from who you are. The wrestling world doesn't slow down. It doesn't pause. It doesn't ask if you're okay. It doesn't check in. It doesn't wait. It moves forward, whether you're ready or not. You show up, you perform, you move on, again and again and again. And after a while, that repetition stops feeling like a schedule and starts feeling like a cycle. One that doesn't break. One that doesn't give you space to step back and ask what it's doing to you. Because in that world, you don't measure how you feel. You measure what you can still do. Can you still perform? Can you still deliver? Can you still meet expectations? And as long as the answer is yes, everything else gets pushed aside. Every match takes something with it. Not always in a way you notice. Not always in a way you feel immediately. But it takes something. A little more impact, a little more strain, a little more wear that doesn't fully recover. And when that becomes normal, you stop questioning it. Because pain is part of the job. Not something to avoid, something to work through, something to ignore, something to outlast. And pushing through it isn't just expected, it's respected. So you don't stop, you don't slow down, you don't ask if something feels off. You keep going because that's what professionals do. You've always done. But over time, that cost adds up. Not all at once, not in a way that forces you to stop. Not in a way that makes everything clear, just slowly, quietly, layer by layer, until something starts to shift. And the shift doesn't announce itself. It doesn't introduce itself as a problem. It blends in. Because the damage isn't always physical. Not in a way you can measure. Not in a way that shows up in one moment. Sometimes it changes how you think, how you react, how you interpret what's happening around you. And when that happens slowly, it doesn't feel like something is wrong. It feels like adaptation, like adjustment, like this is just what it takes to keep going. And after a while, it stops feeling like change at all. It just feels like you, like the way things are now, like the version of yourself that exists in this moment. And that's what makes it so difficult to recognize, because there's no clear line between who you were and who you're becoming. No moment where everything shifts at once, only a gradual movement that feels natural while it's happening. It wasn't obvious at first. That's what makes it dangerous. There were no announcements, no clear turning point, no moment where everything stopped and forced attention. Just small changes, moments that didn't quite feel right, a different tone, a shorter temper, a response that felt slightly out of place, but not enough to question. A kind of intensity that didn't switch off anymore. And when something doesn't switch off, it doesn't stay contained. It carries over into conversations, into reactions, into moments that aren't part of the performance. And over time, that intensity becomes constant. Not something you turn on, but something you live inside. And when you live inside it long enough, you stop noticing it. Because it feels normal. Because it feels familiar. Because it feels like the only way you know how to operate. And by the time anyone else starts to notice it, it's already been there for a while. Settled in, built up, layered into everything, quietly, without ever announcing itself as something that needed to be stopped. And if you were around him, you might notice it. Not all at once, not in a way that immediately stands out. Just small moments. A reaction that lingers a little too long. A silence that feels heavier than it should. A shift in tone that doesn't quite match the moment. But even then, you wouldn't know what you were looking at. Because in that world, intensity is normal, pressure is normal, silence is normal. And when something exists inside a system where those things are expected, it blends in. It hides in plain sight. So those changes get explained away. Just tired, just stressed, just dealing with something, just part of the business. And when everyone around you accepts that explanation, it becomes easier to accept it yourself, because questioning it would mean stopping, and stopping isn't part of the system. So the shift continues, quietly, gradually, without resistance, until one day, it's no longer something you notice at all. And when those changes become part of your identity, they stop feeling like changes. They feel permanent. They feel natural. They feel like the version of you that exists now. They settle in. They shape how you think, how you respond, how you exist day to day. And once something becomes part of your identity, it's harder to separate from it, because it doesn't feel external anymore. It feels internal. There. And the people around you adjust to it. They adapt. They recalibrate their expectations. Because change that happens slowly doesn't feel like change. It feels like continuity. Like nothing has really shifted. Like this is just how things are now. Until something forces you to see it differently. And that moment doesn't always come from within. Sometimes it comes from outside. From a reaction. From a consequence. From something that interrupts the pattern. But until that interruption happens, the pattern continues. Unchallenged. Unquestioned. And that's the part that gets missed. Because nothing about it feels urgent while it's happening. There's no alarm, no clear warning, no signal that says this is building towards something. Just a slow shift that blends into everything else. And by the time it stands out, by the time it becomes something people recognize, it's already been there for a while. Already shaped behavior, already changed perception, already altered the way everything is experienced. In the final days, something felt off. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demanded attention, just different, subtly different. Enough to be noticed, but not enough to be understood. Calls weren't answered, messages went quiet, communication slowed down, and in those moments, there's hesitation, not panic, not urgency, just uncertainty. Because uncertainty doesn't always trigger alarm. Not right away. It lingers, it waits, it looks for an explanation that makes sense. And as long as there's a possibility of explanation, there's no reason to assume the worst. So time passes. Minutes turn into hours. Hours stretch longer than they should. And that quiet space between knowing something is off and understanding what it means grows heavier. Because the absence of answers starts to feel different than the presence of questions. It starts to feel like something isn't just delayed, it's missing. And once that realization begins to take shape, it doesn't come all at once. It builds, the same way everything else did, slowly, quietly, until it becomes something that can't be ignored. Because people assume there's an explanation, there always is. Something simple, something temporary, something that makes the moment make sense. And as long as that possibility exists, there's no urgency, no reason to believe anything is wrong beyond what can be explained. But there comes a point when the explanations stop fitting, when the silence lasts too long, when the absence becomes more noticeable than anything else. And that's when uncertainty begins to change. It stops feeling like a delay and starts feeling like something else entirely. Something heavier, something harder to ignore. And when the truth finally surfaces, it doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't ease its way in. It lands all at once, without preparation, without context that makes it easier to understand. And in that moment, nothing feels real, because it doesn't match what people believed. It doesn't align with the image that had been built over time. It doesn't fit the version of the person that existed in everyone's mind. And that's where the disconnect happens. Because the person people thought they understood and the reality they're now being faced with don't line up. And when those two things don't match, the mind struggles to reconcile it. It looks for something familiar, something that explains how both can exist at the same time. But there isn't anything. There's no clear path from one to the other. Only a sudden break between what was believed and what is now known. And that's what makes it feel impossible. Not just what happened, but how it could exist, alongside everything that came before it. The reaction is immediate. Shock, confusion, silence, where there used to be noise. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not like this. Not to someone who represented control, discipline, consistency. Because that image was never built to include failure. It wasn't built to show cracks. It wasn't built to allow for something like this. It was built to be steady, reliable, predictable, and when that image breaks, there's nothing underneath it that people recognize. Only questions, only confusion, only the realization that what they thought they understood was never complete. And in that moment, everything changes, not gradually, not over time, all at once. The matches don't matter anymore. The titles don't matter anymore. The accomplishments, the legacy, the identity that had been built over years, all of it is redefined. Because once reality interrupts the illusion, there's no way to go back to seeing it the same way. And the weight of that realization doesn't settle immediately. It lingers. It stays suspended in that moment. Because understanding something like this doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds, piece by piece, as people try to process what they've just been confronted with. And as that process begins, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't just a single moment. It wasn't just one event. It wasn't something that appeared out of nowhere. It was connected to everything that came before it. And once that connection starts to form, the questions change. They shift. From what happened to how it happened. From shock to understanding. And that's where the weight really settles in. Because once you start asking how, you start looking backward. And when you look backward, you start seeing things differently. Moments that didn't stand out before start to take on new meaning. Things that felt normal start to feel different. And the realization begins to form that the signs weren't absent. They were just unrecognized, or ignored, or misunderstood. And that realization doesn't bring relief. It brings something heavier. Because it means this wasn't unpredictable. It means this wasn't impossible. It means it was building, quietly, the entire time. But maybe the real story isn't just what happened. Maybe it's everything that came before it. The parts that didn't stand out at the time. The moments that didn't feel important. The signs that were too small to notice, or too easy to dismiss. Because nothing about this felt sudden until it was. Nothing about it felt urgent while it was building. It existed in the background, in patterns, in repetition, in things that felt normal because they had been normal for so long. And that's what makes it difficult to sit with, because it challenges the idea that something like this appears without warning, that it exists in isolation, separate from everything around it. But when you look at it differently, when you step back, when you remove the distance created by time, you start to see something else. Not a single moment, but a series of them. Not one cause, but layers of pressure, layers of change, layers of damage that didn't announce themselves as something dangerous, that didn't demand attention, that didn't force anyone to stop and ask what was happening. They just continued, built on top of each other, quietly, until they became something larger than anyone realized. And maybe that's the hardest part. Not the shock, not the confusion, not even the outcome, but the realization that it didn't come out of nowhere, that it was there, in pieces, in moments, in things that were easier to ignore than to confront. Because confronting something like that requires stopping. It requires questioning. It requires seeing something that people aren't always ready to see. And in an environment that moves as fast as this one, where performance is constant, where expectations never slow down, stopping isn't something that happens easily. So things continue until they don't. And by the time everything becomes clear, it's already too late to change it. The scariest part isn't what happened. It's how close it was to being preventable. And maybe that's what stays with people. Not just the outcome, but the idea that something could build that far without being clearly understood. That the distance between perception and reality can become that wide. Because if that distance can exist here, it can exist anywhere, in anyone. And the idea that something can change that much without being fully recognized isn't just uncomfortable, it's unsettling. Because it means the signs aren't always obvious. They don't always stand out. They don't always demand attention. Sometimes they blend in. Sometimes they feel normal. And sometimes they're only understood after everything has already changed. This episode reflects on publicly known information and widely discussed factors surrounding this story. It is not intended to assign definitive causes, but to examine the patterns, the pressures, and the warning signs that are often only recognized in hindsight. Some stories don't end when they're over. They stay. In the questions that never got answered. In the moments that didn't make sense at the time. In the realization that things could have been different if something had been seen sooner. If something had been understood differently. If something had been taken seriously before it became impossible to ignore. And that's where this story remains. Not just in what happened, but in what it reveals. About pressure, about identity, about the cost of never stepping away, and about the things that can change quietly, without